Kubota and Nakatsuru had an interview where they were asked various questions and they had an autograph session and created some original art for Dragon Ball Daima. These guys are the artists behind Dragon Ball Daima, so let's go ahead and jump into the interview and see what we can learn. With such a varied and intense style, what do you consider to be your peak professional moment, your best scene? The answer, all the scenes were challenging, but in particular, the last episode of Daima was tough for half the time due to the Kamehameha sequence. However, the scene that struck me the most was the missile scene in episode 14 of Gurren Lagann. Now, the Kamehameha scene at the end of Dragon Ball Daima was probably one of the most intense Kamehamehas, and it's crazy because Goku in the same series had a record-shattering, a pretty iconic Kamehameha scene as well. So this is something that honestly is pretty crazy, but that Kamehameha scene where he's drawing the power had a lot of references to a lot of Dragon Ball intros, so I can see how this one would be particularly tough, especially with all the layers packed onto it. How do you maintain character proportions and details across different shots, especially with dynamic camera movements? It doesn't exist. It's just a huge hassle. I don't know if the content was actually correct, but I still had to constantly make sure the proportions were always right. And then there are the details. When a large character shrinks into the background, of course, the details need to be reduced. But even the way they are simplified requires a certain level of sensitivity. That's where you can tell who's skilled and who isn't. Everyone reveals their own level. Absolutely goated response, because if you guys don't remember, a lot of Dragon Ball Super, especially when it's zoomed out and you see the background characters, they have minimalistic features. Some of them are wonky, and Dragon Ball Daima just isn't like that. The characters still retain a lot of the details that are really important. Specifically, I feel like the eyes need to be retained, especially when you're talking about certain characters in background shots. But this is not just something that is pertaining to Dragon Ball at all. It is also about Invincible, who just came out with their finale. But if you look at that show, even in some of the best scenes, if you look at the background characters, once the characters are minimalized, I mean, a lot of them are missing faces or features or whatever. So the way that he says it, that this is a true measure of someone's skill and the mastery of their skill, if they can keep certain proportions good and details good to the point where you can still tell it's still the same character, that's a good response. Shintani and Cell spots. Speaking of Cell spots, which I mentioned earlier as an example, if we look at the beginning of Dragon Ball Super Superhero, in the hand-drawn animation part, Cell appears at some point, right? While he transforms, moves, and shifts from the foreground to the background during those transitions, I would only draw Cell's basic form and ask someone to refine the rougher parts between frames, or add the spots on his body. For instance, I asked Shintani, who worked at the character designer for Broly, to draw only Cell spots, but in the end he got fed up and said, I don't want to do this anymore. It's a luxury to be able to assign these kinds of tasks to someone who handled the character design for the previous movie, almost like having an assistant. Really, when I think about it, back in the TV series days, there was so little time. Unlike with the movies, I kept wondering, did they really do this kind of work for TV all the time? Which, no, they didn't. A lot of Dragon Ball Z, you can look at the background characters, they're missing a lot of things, and actually Cell specifically goes in and out of spots quite frequently. I mean, those spots are just horrendous, and it's not just Akira Toriyama saying it. Now we got Kubota, Nakatsuru, and even Shintani just giving up on adding spots to Cell. According to Yamamuro, there was a rivalry among Dragon Ball animators to outdo each other. Has that atmosphere continued for Dragon Ball Super Superhero and Daima? Back in those days, Yamamuro considered some colleagues as rivals, in a good way. In his prime, Yamamuro was probably by far the most skilled. If he had to find someone to compete against, it might have been Nakatsuru. I don't know how Yamamuro saw Nakatsuru, but if I were him, I would have had a sort of rivalry with Nakatsuru. I'm convinced that Yamamuro himself was aware of how talented Nakatsuru was. Each animator has their own unique qualities, and as we mentioned earlier, When comparing Nakatsuru and Yamamuro, for example, Nakatsuru was able to replicate Toriyama's style almost perfectly, absolutely correct, as if he had the same natural talent. Yamamuro, on the other hand, in the TV and the movie production of Dragon Ball, was able to maintain a certain level of quality at high speed. He was fast at drawing, so he consistently ensured a good standard in a short time. Nakatsuru, however, wasn't as fast. Yamamuro knew very well that his greatest strength was his speed of execution. Similarly, even the animators worked on today's Dragon Ball projects such as Daima, Superhero Broly, and so on, including myself, each have their own style. We inspire and challenge each other, but we're not all competing on the same playing field. As I also mentioned on stage yesterday, it's amazing when you see animators like Onishi's It's Insane, or when you look at the drawings and think it's not exactly a pure Toriyama style, but these differences are what make it fun, right? So with the Yamamuro thing, I know original goated prime Yamamuro was like a cut above the rest, but I think as time went on with Yamamuro, and exactly what he's saying here is that he is really fast at creating the artwork. So when that happens, a lot of the details get simplified, and that's where we get like really shiny hair and simplistic features on Goku and the clothing and all that stuff, which to me I think is not the best way to go when it comes to Dragon Ball. You want more details, not less. In Dragon Ball, there are off-screen events that we know happened. For example, Goku discovering Super Saiyan 3 in the afterlife. Is there a similar scene you would love to animate? That is a great question. What do they want to put on screen that nobody ever saw? To be honest, I had never really thought about it, so I don't have an answer that would meet expectations. Oh, that's disappointing. However, regarding such an approach, considering that Toriyama Sensei has unfortunately passed away and that Dragon Ball will continue, perhaps there will be thoughts of animating episodes that have never been given much focus here. It could be an interesting idea. What he's saying is that because Dragon Ball, he's saying Dragon Ball will continue, which we've heard before, but this is like the latest version of Dragon Ball will continue by an artist on Dragon Ball Daima. Dragon Ball is going to continue forward, but he's saying maybe in the future we'll see something we haven't seen before. Personally, the story I love the most is Bardock, the father of Goku. Bardock is Goku's father, and they created an original episode showing what happened before Goku arrived on Earth. At the time, it was really exciting, and it moved me a lot. You could say it serves as sort of an episode for Goku before he reached our planet. If in the future another story were to be created to fill these narrative gaps, I'd really love to work on it. Yeah, we need a full Bardock show, or maybe a movie, a Bardock movie with King Vegeta, and just something like epic, like a space opera epic, something like that, where we see what the Saiyans are all about and just the dynamic nature between them, maybe the legend of Yamoshi, something along those lines. Furusawa Junya. Once when I was in elementary school, I used to read a magazine called Animedia, which is still around today and is entirely dedicated to animation. If I remember correctly, I was in 6th grade in 1990. There was no internet back then, so I enjoyed browsing the reading section. You'd find people who could draw really well, and their age and other details were also listed. I would think, wow, this person is really talented. Among them was someone named Furusawa Junya, who was still an amateur at the time. He wrote, "I've just been entrusted with drawing illustrations for Dragon Ball merchandise." It was his debut and the magazine published it. So as a reader, I basically got to witness his first steps in the industry. As a fan, I was really excited by the idea that someone like us, who was just part of the audience, could start working professionally in the field. And then when he passed away, so he's talking about another artist that he admires and that he kind of saw grow up. Same thing with Toyotaro. A lot of the fans that are fans of Dragon Ball seem to be working on it at some level here in the future. During the autograph session, they were asked if maybe there was some color for Super Saiyan 4 Trunks that they would like to put on him, and they said black. A black Super Saiyan 4 Trunks would be great. And that was basically it on the interview. I'm gonna leave a link to it in the description below. You guys can go ahead and check it out for yourselves. A lot of good stuff in here, very interesting. I love the fact that they say Dragon Ball Super will return, or Dragon Ball continues, and just a lot of the information on telling stories that we've never seen before. And then a black Super Saiyan 4 Trunks I mean, are we going to see future Trunks return? Is that what they're trying to hint at? I don't know. Maybe they're just spitballing here, but let me know what you guys think in the comments.